Perfect. It looks like we're live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the LearnWardleyMapping live stream today on July 27th. Thank you for being here. Today, I am so grateful to be joined by Mario Platt. He works for Privacy Beacon, and he has contributed quite a lot of interesting ideas and thoughts in the LearnWardleyMapping community around security, and he's got a lot of interesting things to share. Today, he volunteered to talk to us a little bit about security with his talk. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mario.
Yep, thank you for that. So the talk today for the community is a combination of some material that I've been creating about how to apply some of the Wardley mapping concepts into the security, which is my area. So the name of the talk is Evolution Informed Security Strategy: Surviving and Striving in the Next Decade. So using the concept of Wardley mapping, I'd like to expose what I think, what I'm seeing as some of the patterns that are emerging, how the industry is evolving, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. So in terms of overall of how the talk is going to go, we'll start with some context about the industry. We will then go on to discuss some strategy concepts. So not only on Wardley mapping, but also some wider concepts. And the main thing that I want to achieve with that is make sure that we have a common understanding of terms. So I'm going to be defining some terms to make sure that that we can all that everyone can follow along. For those already familiar with Wardley mapping, that's good. But this talk is not meant to be an introduction to Wardley mapping. So if you're already familiar with the concepts behind Wardley mapping, some of the things that you will be seeing kind of the basics. And I'm going to also be providing some guidance on, even if you're not completely familiar with Wardley mapping, how to navigate the content that I'm going to be showing you. And finally, I'm going to be wording and framing the concepts and how I see some patterns happening in the security industry as problems. And we're going to talk about 4 different problems that I believe going into the next decade, so into the 2020s, that the security industry as a whole will need to figure out a way of dealing with them. So without further ado, so in terms of where the industry is right now, in terms of context, so cyber attacks are now the third most likely global risk for 2018. And this is not said by security professionals trying to get more budget. This is being said by the World Economic Forum, right? So cyber attacks are only behind weather conditions and natural disasters. So at the moment, things relating to global warming, etc. So this should tell us something. It's not only just in the domains of the professionals. It's now understood in the wider economic world that it's an issue, that it's affecting everyone. Also, in terms of the costs of data breaches, we also have some interesting numbers. So year on year, things have been increasing. And we now have a few numbers from 2018's Ponemon Institute that we know that on average, it's costing $148 each record that is lost or stolen. But what is interesting about this number is that this is an average. So it typically ranges from everything around $75 for government across the world, and it can go up to almost 400 in the health industry. So it's quite diverse in terms of how much breaches are costing organizations. And an overall cost of dealing with it around 3.86 million, which is a lot of money. And these are the numbers for those organizations working in Europe pre-GDPR. So this is not even including a lot of the fines that at the moment are still going to be appealed in higher courts. But there's already mention of quite substantial numbers in the many millions compared to up until last year, where in the UK, the maximum fine was £500,000. Right? So we're now talking about up to 2 or 4% of global turnover when some of these things happen. And we will get back to that, to the part in a bit, but in terms of how the industry is spending their money, we can see a few interesting statistics here as well. So most of it, 74% of organizations are spending it on best practices, and 69% on compliance mandates. And I'll go into a bit more detail what I believe that means, but in a nutshell, I believe that's also problematic in itself, and it's a number that is telling us people that are more accustomed to worldly mapping lingo that we're following too many memes without really understanding, having good situational awareness of where we should be spending our money. So this was something that Simon Wardley originally came up with as a joke, but in terms of the enterprise adoption cycle in IT. So the rest of the world sees a change coming, they start adopting it, but in enterprise IT, we seem to wait until the last minute when the change is completely unavoidable to actually start doing something about it. Right? So I believe in security, we're probably even a bit worse than that, because we wait for IT enterprise to actually do something for us to start getting worried about it. So we even have a further delay into how those things usually go. So in terms of our stages, once enterprise IT gets to the oh fudge phase, we go on to an over my dead body. But and unfortunately, this is something that I've seen a lot in the past in many organizations that I worked with. A particular one that I portray as kind of an anecdote of how these things usually come is I even saw a head of information security that I worked with mentioned on a business meeting that we shouldn't do a move of a particular platform onto the cloud because his personal data was there. But that's the level of gut reactions that a lot of people in the industry still have into adopting new practices and doing things in a different way. That one literally hurt my stomach, I can tell you that. Then we go through the phase of, once we see that the change is inevitable, we start going through the phase of this is all going to go wrong. Within 3 months, we're going to be breached. This is bad, and we start spreading the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, not only with our enterprise IT counterparts, but also to the wider business on trying to stop the change or give us the 6 months, 9 months, 18 months that we're accustomed on assessing something and then moving on, okay? Which is, again, not how the world works anymore. And then also experience tells me that we go through the phase where people make themselves unreachable, and there's usually a round of redundancies and new hires, and new blood needs to come in to deal with the new practices. Which is typically one of two different approaches. Either it's someone that understood the concepts, understood how the business is moving, how IT transformation is now happening, and has a solution or a good approximation of how they're going to deal with the situation. Or option B, that I've also seen happen, someone that is probably as clueless as the previous people that were there before, and not really internalize how the systems, how things now work. But he understands what led to the demise of his of who was there previously, and he wants to make sure that he doesn't make the same mistakes. Okay, so that's usually the two types of situations that I've seen happen. So that was in terms of context where I believe we are overall as an industry. So the big question on having an evolution-inspired security strategy is, first we need to agree what is strategy, right? And more than that, I'd like to actually reference a different author, not Simon Wardley, but is my strategy good or bad? Right? So in terms of strategy and what it is. A good strategy needs to be straightforward, simple, and easy to understand. If we are going to make a strategy something that is complex, throw a lot of memes, a lot of different standards, a lot of different practices onto it, it's going to get complicated, and it's going to be very difficult not only to generate alignment with the organization, but also to generate a drive from the people that need to implement it. Right? So I'm a really big fan of keeping things simple and having some very clear direction on what we're trying to achieve. So that implies that we need to be identifying what are the essential issues that are troubling the industry. Right? So it's not about getting, so I really like, for instance, in security, the NIST framework, and at the high level, it's really good, right? It's five principles that you want to achieve. The problem is you go 2 levels of detail down the line and you're looking at 614 controls, right? So we need to word things in a way and build them in a way where things are simple and we can achieve that alignment and drive from our teams. So in military strategy, in the military, how they achieve strategy is much simpler, generally speaking. So you usually have a place for situational awareness, where you're going to be identifying a where. Okay, so you know what your problem is, you know what you want to achieve, and you know not only what are your own capabilities, but you understand your terrain, your landscape. You understand the things that you want to. You understand the pieces that are going to be the constraints or the enablers of the changes that you need to be making. And then you've got a why, right? So you've got an objective, either that's a very big objective, or it's a proximate objective that you know you need to achieve before you move on to bigger and better things, right? But you always have that direction of exactly what it is that you need to be achieving. And that's about situational awareness. It's about understanding, again, what surrounds you and what are your own capabilities of what you can leverage. And then you've got the action, meaning the how, the tactics. You go in security specifically, that's when you decide you're going to use an intrusion detection system. That's when you decide you're going to be using a particular IT solution so that you can contain malware when you've got a malware outbreak on your network. So it's about those very specific things on how you're going to bring some of these concepts to life operationally. Then there's a very good book. So before I became acquainted with Simon Wardley, my concept of strategy came from Richard Romel's book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I think it's a wonderful book. Everyone should read. And he talks about exactly that. So what is good strategy and what is bad strategy? So a good strategy is based on a diagnosis. Right? So you understand your industry, you understand your business, you understand your internal capabilities, you understand how much, all of the resources that you have available to you, and you make a diagnosis of your situation. Okay. Then you have a guiding policy. Okay. And the word policy can be, especially in security, can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. So what I'm talking about here is not your information security policies. I'm talking about the policy that will be driving your strategy. Okay, so what I'm talking about, after you make your diagnosis, you are going to decide what are the key objectives that are the next objectives in your relative to your maturity, to where you are, to how your business is operating, and that is going to be the guiding policy for your strategy. Okay, that may mean that is going to then be translated into the plan of what to do on the next 6 months. It may mean that then that is going to be the plan that is going to of what is going to happen over the next 2 to 5 years. Right, it depends on where you are and how you're going to be aligning everything to deliver those benefits. And then it's about coming up with a set of coherent actions. Okay, so it's not going back to the NIST example when you've got the 614 controls. It's not about trying, okay, let's try and do 300 over the next 2 years, right? It's about getting a set of coherent actions that is going to get you to a good place on a few of those, right? So that you can be targeted about the effort that you're putting in. In bad strategy, so that's the other side of it. So bad strategy is about fluff and memes, right? It's about looking at, for instance, the Gartner Magic Quadrant and saying, okay, so I need to go, Gartner said that EDR solutions or SIEM is going to be the next big thing. So that's where I'm going to be spending my money on. Right? And that's a big difference in military terms to in how in military they approach strategy, and a lot of how strategy is done in the security space. Okay. Because using an example in that Simon jokingly usually says, and I really like it, so I'm going to steal that from him, is when a general decides he's going to bomb a hill, it's not because Gartner says that 68% of generals bomb hills, but it's because he understands the landscape. It's because you understand the landscape, you understand what it is you want to achieve, and you decided that the tactic to apply to that situation is bombing the hill. Right? So not about what everyone else is doing. It's about what are the compliance standards, or what is being said that are the 3 critical things you should be doing. You do need to take those in consideration because it talks about wider issues. But first and foremost, you need to look at your organization, and you need to understand where you are and what your maturity is in order to define a good strategy for your organization. Then the other one is failure to face the challenge. Right? And this is where things like problem preference bias sometimes comes into play, depending on the experience of the person setting strategy. Right? So if you come from a development background, you'll probably have a preference to see all of the problems that you're going to program your way out of them. Right? If you come from a business background, maybe you are going to see the problems as only business, and that just by doing a couple of things or presenting to the right people, getting the right buy-in from a few stakeholders is going to solve your problem. Right? So depending on the biases that you bring to the table, it may make you see problems in a certain way, which may not necessarily be the best way you should be looking at them, because obviously these things are all complex, and we need to, and for different problems, there are going to be different tactics that you are going to need to employ. Then it's mistaking goals for strategy. That's also another thing that happens a lot. So before, and I've seen this in most organizations that I work with, so we will be top in class in our industry with regards to security. Well, if people are leaving the organization and 6 months afterwards, you still have people with valid accounts on systems, then that's not really where your strategy should be, right? And there's probably a few maturity steps that you need to take before you define those high-level goals that end up almost being meaningless, because the people that are going to drive that program can clearly see through those words that that's not attainable, that's not where you are, and you lose that alignment with your own resources, with your team, to actually make it happen and to give good steps forward. And then it's about strategic objectives, okay, which can also be very related to following memes and focusing on the latest and greatest type of technology that came onto the market without fixing your basics first. So Wardley, Simon Wardley, he was a former CEO, and he developed the concepts behind Wardley mapping at a time where he was feeling as an imposter as a CEO. Okay. So he spent a considerable amount of time trying different things, and he came up with a few ideas applied to business in general. And what I'm doing here is trying to apply those same principles onto information security. But he came up with a way to approach strategy in a topographical way, so using maps. Again, this is not going to be a crash course on Wordly mapping. I am going to be referring to a few of the concepts that I believe are important, and I'm going to give you some hints on how to read some of the maps that I'm going to be showing you, just to get everyone hopefully on the same page, and so that I can make myself understood. So basically what Simon Wardley did was combine 2 concepts. Using Zhang Tzu's 5 factors and OODA loops, which we'll be talking about next, he created what he called the strategy cycle. Okay, so the 5 factors in Sun Tzu, it's about purpose. So what is your moral imperative, what it is that you're trying to achieve. Then you have landscape, so the environment that you're competing in. So with regards to security specifically, I like to think of landscape in terms of your, for instance, it also includes your internal control environment. Right? So those are the things that your organization does and how securely it does them. Okay. Then we have climate, so the forces that are acting upon your environment. So from a security perspective, I like to think of climate as not only let's say the threat community, okay, so the overall threat landscape, which is kind of overlaps with what was mentioned previously as landscape, but it's I like to think of climate exactly the forces that act upon our environment, right? So how more evolved the attackers are getting, the types of tools and tactics that they're using, so that we can then understand how we're going to protect our organizations against them. And climate is also about new types of technology coming along. What are the things that may be at your disposal and that you should be considering in your decision making and in your budgeting, etc. Then you've got your doctrine. So doctrine is universal principles that are applicable independent of context. So are things that are usually you can apply them safely because you know that over time they've always been valid and they don't rely on any specific context to be valid and to be useful. So those would be the standard ways of operating, techniques that you can apply, etc. And then it's about leadership, right? So about making decisions, about leading the organization through developing that strategy and actually delivering on the components of that strategy. And so the other part to Simon Wardley's approach is the OODA Loop. So the OODA Loop was developed by John Boyd in the Air Force, American Air Force, and the basic idea behind the OODA Loop, especially being developed for the Air Force, is that if you manage to get yourself inside your opponent's OODA Loop, you always have an advantage. Okay, because you'll be able to orient your decisions and make decisions and act faster than your opponent will be. So you'll always be a step ahead of what's happening. That's the basic idea. But as you can see from the side, it's about observing your environment. It's about orienting, so making the decisions that you're going to be making, not only strategically, but also on a day-to-day operational basis. Orienting the organization towards some good outcomes, then making decisions based on that orientation, and finally acting. Okay, and the thing to note about OODA loops is that this is not a waterfall type activity. You've got feedback loops in them. Right? So whenever you're developing strategy, whenever you've developed plans and started going down a particular route, if you start getting feedback from the environment, from any part of your environment, your business, your tools, your team, that something is not working, that's then your opportunity to then observe, orient, and go again. Right? There's an iterative nature to all of this. So the strategy cycle, this is what it looks like. So you've got the Sun Tzu's 5 factors, and you've got an OODA loop that goes around it. So here you need to, again, understand landscape, you need to understand your climate, you need to apply doctrine, and then you need to make decisions as the leader to drive your organization to improve their security posture. So this is a slide that I've put together just to make sure that that ideally we can all have a basic understanding of how to read a map. Okay, so it starts with a user need typically at the top. We identify what it is that we're trying to achieve. Then we draw out the value chain of what are the needs to make that happen. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples in security. For instance, at the top, having automated, what does that mean from a security point of view in terms of the components to make your security automation. And then you finally you have an evolution. Okay, and the evolution, for the purposes of this talk, it's going to be one of two things. We're either going to be talking about technology and the particular component, and the way to read it is using what you see here, right? So something that is Genesis, an idea that you just came up with, something that you've custom built yourself for your organization. For instance, for the sake of argument, let's say you built in Python a way to make manual backups of your firewalls, right? So that would be a component that you've custom built to deal with a particular challenge. A product is when you go to one of the many security vendors and buy a product off the shelf in order to deliver some type of security benefit. And finally, a commodity or utility. So for the purposes of this talk, in security, I'm mostly considering in the commodity and utility space the use of SaaS services to achieve some of the things that up until 5 years ago we were doing with on-prem products. Okay, so when you look at the evolution in the stages 1 to 4, that's what they mean. The further to the right, the more SaaS-like or SaaS they are. The further to the left are things that are not yet proven, that you've either just started out as a concept or that you've custom built to fit a specific need of your organization. Okay, or things that you may inherit as well. In the second use case we're going to have for the visualization of the maps is on practices. Okay, and to keep it simple, you can think of the overlay on practices. So here, novel, emerging, good, and best. You can think of it as a CMM scale, capability maturity model. Okay, the further to the left, it's going to be less mature. The further to the right, it's going to be more mature. Right. So again, this is not meant to be an intro to Wordly mapping, but just because I'm going to be showing you some maps, I want to make sure that you can have a look and at least have a basic understanding of how to read it. So this is a map that I've created, and I've then validated and got some further feedback, and it resulted in a few changes at the Open Security Summit. So it is an OWASP event that happens yearly here in the UK. So following the ideas of Simon Wardley, so we've got a purpose, we've got an imperative, and a scope. And I wanted to clearly define something that I believe would make sense for security and that could be used in all types of scenarios. Okay, so in terms of purpose, what we as security professionals are here to do is to achieve a secure state relative to the value and the operational risk. Okay, so it's not just deploying all the security products, it's not just adopting all the best practices, it's doing something that is right for our organization, and that is fit for purpose, that allows our organization to move forward, to operate, that we take in consideration not only the business revenue and the maturity of the organization itself, but also the actual operational risk that is being posed by each of the elements. Okay? Because on one hand, you don't want to be lacking diligence because you've spent no resources dealing with the security of something in your organization. On the other hand, you also cannot be in the position, because the business wouldn't accept it, of spending up to 40 or 50% of the business revenue protecting it. Right? Because that would also not make business sense. So this is all relative to the organization and the maturity of the organization, and the actual operational risk put by a particular course of action in the organization, particular practice, or activity within your organization. Now, originally, this list only had one imperative, but unfortunately, in the security industry as a whole, I believe we are still at a space where I thought we should add two, right? So compliance is still a big driver of how people approach the security. So doing security to tick off the boxes that we know our auditors are going to be looking at, or just to fulfill a particular requirement that came from somewhere. And in there, you can see here, it's on stage 3. We're getting a bit good at dealing with that. What I don't think that as an industry we got right yet is how to have the imperative as security being an enabler of the business. And that's one of the things that that I think we should be aiming to do more of. And again, from a business point of view, the business wants to survive and thrive, right? But the role of security in organizations it's different. We are there to support the survival, right? We are there to ensure that we help the organization manage the risk of doing business. Okay? Because security in and of itself isn't worth very much, right? If something doesn't have an inherent value, then there's no point in securing it. So it always needs to be relative to that anchor. So in terms of supporting this survival, I've worded it as providing reasonable assurance against the predictable threats. Right? So it's not about protecting against all the possible threats that that exist out there, because there are many. But it's about making sure that you do the homework, that you do the threat modeling, that you do the risk assessments to understand what are the predictable threats, and that you find reasonable plans of dealing with those threats. But because we know that we're never going to reach a state where there's zero risk, right? So we need to think about how we're going to be providing a reasonable assurance back to our boards, back to our stakeholders on what the risk actually is and how we are proposing to mitigate those risks, either by reduction, avoidance, many different ways to approach risk management. Then underneath the line of the organization, this is mainly the SAPSA enterprise framework. So we will do things on assurance, systems engineering, logical abstractions. We'll have security components. So all those things underneath. And also that is going to be relevant to the next section, the business context and the business attributes that we're trying to achieve. We'll get more to that a bit later, but what I mean by business attributes is what I was saying previously. So enabling time to market, making sure that we've got an auditable organization, making sure that we have authenticated as one of the business attributes that that the IT organization implements every time they build a new system. It's that type of level. So what we're going to be talking about today, which is we finally got to it, is about what I believe are 4 problems that I'm going to be using an evolution-inspired approach to talk about them. So those 4 problems are the communications problem, the engineering problem, the management problem, and the skills and talent problem. And we're going to go have a look at them one by one. So just to make sure, because I make a reference in the main slide of each of the problems, I just want to revisit 2 concepts that are important in worldly mapping. So one of them is doctrine. So these are the universally applicable principles that are irrespective of context or the value chain. So whatever you're doing, these are principles that are valid and you should be acting on. And the other concept is climate. So the economic and competitive patterns which influence your environment. Okay, so those are the 2 concepts that you need to understand in order to understand the rest of the talk. So in terms of the communications problem, I think so. I quite like cowboy movies, etc. So when a particular scenario, a film called Cool Hand Luke, and a nice section of it is when the prison chief says, "What we've got here is a failure to communicate after hitting Luke in the head." Right? It wasn't before; it was after he hit him in the head, which I think kind of illustrates a lot of what sometimes InfoSec people feel they're getting done by their organizations. But the reality is we do have a failure to communicate. And that failure to communicate is not just from us, InfoSec professionals, to the business. It's also us, different teams under the CISO, right? And we're going to go through why I believe there's that that gap in communication and what we can do about it. So one of the important principles of doctrine, what is called some of the phase one principles, is adopting a common language. Okay. In the security field, I think we have a need to ensure that we are adopting a common language, not only in talking with the different security teams. So different security teams, I mean, security incident management, I mean risk management, I mean assurance or audits, but also towards the organization. So talking in ways that the business will understand what we're on about. So I propose three different tactics that we can use to try and address the communication problem, which is adopting a threat taxonomy, adopting a cybersecurity style guide, and adopting a subset layered mappings approach, which we'll go through next. In terms of climate, this is about speed, right? So one of the principles in climate is that the evolution of the communication mechanisms increase the speed of evolution overall, right? So this is at a macro level, but I think it's also relevant within organizations, because the more we have an opportunity to enable that communication with the rest of our organization and achieve that alignment that we're all working towards the same ends, the easier it will be for the business to adopt some of the tactics and measures that we are suggesting, and also making sure that the plans are aligned with each other so that we can all move faster. So what I'm saying is, once we start adapting some common language, then hopefully not only the business context, but the business attributes we are using are going to evolve. Okay, and that's what we are aiming to achieve. So in terms of what the actual communication problem is that on the business side of things, we have a particular type of language. Okay, and that language is about the business value of assets, the business value chains, what's happening on the market, the shareholder pressure, the business success factors. It's all those things that the business doesn't necessarily care about the lingo in each of the individual departments. And by that, I mean the lingo used in IT, the lingo used in marketing, the lingo used in InfoSec, right? It's about what where the whole ship needs to go, right? So it's non-context specific. It's what the business is wanting to achieve for their customers, for the market, etc. So it's more outward facing, and they are the ones who typically get all the external pressure, right? So from the shareholders, from the customers. So what happens at large in society in general. Then you go on the other side of things, you've got assurance. Okay, so that's typically the lingo used by auditors. So you're going to have your control testing, you're going to have your testing procedures, you're going to have the people with the spreadsheets ticking boxes, asking you questions and ticking all the boxes, with some wording that usually aligns more to business than some of the more engineering facing areas. Then you've got systems engineering. So you've got more things that are more specific to the type of tech stack that is used within organizations, and a lot of and people will adopt terms that they use that if you get someone from marketing or from operations, they may not necessarily understand everything that is being said. So it's also going to generate its own jargon. And not only that, but people tend to think in a different way in engineering. Right? Because when you talk about to an engineer, he's going to think trade-offs and constraints, right? So it's not just it's not that that's not a good idea, which someone in business may be more prone to think of things as good or bad ideas in the overall scheme of things. But in engineering, you usually get more of a conversation around constraints, around trade-offs, etc. Then in the security components, that's all the FUD generated by vendors and everything that happens more in the marketing or commercial space. So it's sales speak, it's Gartner, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's deeply technical jargon. So you typically, because most security products in 2019 are so narrow in scope that in order for them to portray their value, they go very deeply into the technical jargon of the very narrow thing that they're doing, right? So in order for someone, a generalist in security, to really understand what's going on, it requires a lot of, it requires studying, and it requires going very deep into some areas that you may not necessarily be an expert on. Okay, so a good example would be on encryption. Okay, so I've been involved in security for 23 years now. I understand encryption. I've done a lot of things with encryption in the past, but I'm not a mathematician, right? There can very quickly we would get to a point where I can no longer help you, right? That we're going to have to get someone that is a true technical expert in encryption, and yeah, we're going to have to follow up the conversation elsewhere. And finally, operational security. So that's more about processes, procedures, SLAs. And if we look specifically at security, we're going to be talking about security incidents, about indicators of compromise. So things, again, that are very specific to how you handle incidents. Now, the challenge is everyone that's worked, and I've had the pleasure of working in all of the areas. So I've had roles more business facing as a consultant, as a product manager in marketing. I've had roles as head of assurance, managing 4 assurance teams. I was a security engineer for about 8 years, doing a lot of security component integration as well. And I've managed security operations teams. So I'm lucky enough to have hands-on experience on all of the above. So I understand that, and actually with my own organization, I can see that that's usually what people end up paying me for, to serve as a translator between these different teams, right? And that's usually what people hire me for, because I kind of understand the language specific to each of those domains, and there's huge value in being able to translate between stakeholders, right? Especially in the security field these days. But the challenge here in the reality is that these people use different words, and they have different types of concerns, and there's typically not much connecting them together, right? And sometimes, and I've have firsthand experience on, when you get risk managers talking with incident management people, it's going to be difficult, right? Because they're at completely different stages, and they have completely different concerns, right? So risk management is focused on risks and the impact to business. And sometimes incident management is more focused on recovering. They're focused on the tools they don't have, and they could have done a better job. All those other things that are more operational in nature, but that the business may not be very concerned with, right? So that happens a lot. So what I propose as one of the ways to address the communication challenge is adopting a common threat taxonomy, right? So a lot of standards, including SAPSA that we're going to be talking about next, they talk about threat taxonomy as its own thing, right? Personally, that's good. In threats, you can always relate to vulnerabilities, etc. But I think there's an untapped potential if you just use threats like that, because I believe threats have the opportunity to bring together the different concerns in a simple line that can be understood by everyone. Right? And if you adopt a common taxonomy that enables you to map those threats across vulnerabilities, incidents, and risks, and do this at scale, then it's much easier to have conversations. So let me show you an example of what I mean. So, for instance, let's imagine this scenario where we had a phishing incident. So here on the bottom, you will see that we had an incident, and that we had a contact center user that clicked an infected email, and so his machine was infected with malware. Right. So if we go back to the ENISA threat taxonomy, which is the European agency, I quite like it. We can see that the threat, you go to the catalog, and you can see that that concern, as exposed by the incident manager, you can see that it's about the threat of malicious code and receive of unsolicited email. Right? You go to the taxonomy; those exist, and you use as metadata. This is the concern that I'm concerned with. So at that point, it gives the incident manager all the flexibility in the world to develop his own narrative around the incident, but you have a way to tie it up to the other parts of the ecosystem about the vulnerabilities and the risks that are going to highlight themselves from the incident that you're experiencing. So then, because of that, you found 3 vulnerabilities. First one was that the host AV didn't detect that particular type of malware. That's why it got infected. So there's a vulnerability there. And that means there was inadequate adaptation of your security software to how that was going on. The other vulnerability that you found out was that your mail filter should have detected that malware, but it didn't because it hadn't been updated in 2 months. Okay, so you have the threat of erroneous administration of devices. Again, this is all part of the taxonomy. You go and you choose as metadata what actually happened from the taxonomy. Then you're going to deploy a corrective control, which is update the mail filter with the latest signatures. In this instance, so this is about this other risk here that you actually found out, and this was supported by your risk team, that you have a clause. This would be a B2B business, and you've got a clause that says that you keep your signatures up to date. Right? So at that point, the risk team identified it's clause 12.4 on our standard contractual clauses that were not meeting by that control having failed. Right? So you can tie into, again, the failure of meeting those contractual requirements. Then you've identified that from an operational perspective, what ended up happening was the customer service function couldn't operate whilst those devices were being brought online, right? So that ended up happening, affecting the whole contact center, and you've had downtime. So this here, you've breached your SLA, so that was the failure to meet your contractual requirements. And then that led you to a few business impacts. So the direct business impact of not meeting, of having to give service credits to your customers. So you've lost 6 hours outage was resulting in £60,000 worth of service credits that you're going to have to pay your customers or not earn. And again, you still have the risk of potentially one of your customers getting litigation against you because when you published your root cause analysis, they saw that you didn't have an up-to-date mail filter, and they can come after you because you weren't meeting the contractual requirements. So you can potentially have, let's say, up to the X amount of contracts that could cost the organization X million pounds as a result. And again, that was because of the threat of failing to meet contractual requirements. Okay. Then tying this onto business management and what the business expects from you. So in security, it's not just about control, which is a bit on compliance, but it's also, as I was talking, security as an enabler. Right? So what this business impact actually means in business terms is that we are failing against the business attributes of being reputable and being perceived as competent, right? Because those were all things that we could have done something about. And from a control perspective, we know we had issues in the maintainability of our systems, on how compliant they are, and how recoverable our business functions are. Right? You can, at scale, then create all of these connections to enable all of the security teams to do their job. Okay? Because experience tells me, for instance, that if you were to leave everything at the incident and vulnerability level, that may not make it crystal clear to the risk managers on what the situation actually was, because the narrative will be built in a way that is more understood by the people who are subject matter experts on that narrower part of security. Right? And if you do apply a threat taxonomy at scale, then you enable, because at that point, the risk manager doesn't need to understand everything that happened down here. He just needs to read the metadata to get the glimpse, to get the short version of what the problem was. And then the narrative adds detail to that. Right? But it enables people to actually understand what's going on without having to be deeply technical on one part of the or on one particular subject matter expertise within security. So this is how I propose that a threat taxonomy is used in order to enable that, that communication, not only between different security teams by this threat analysis, by this the application of threat taxonomy for metadata, but also again what it means to the business in terms of attributes. Okay, and enable that whole communication, yeah, and make it easier for people to understand each other. The other part, which is related problem, is what I call the meaning problem. Okay, so again, if you go talk to an incident manager and to a risk manager, they will probably end up using different words, but they actually mean the same thing. Okay, so using attacker, malicious user, malicious actor, those are things that are kind of interchangeable, right? So the problem is not that people aren't using the same terms necessarily, because yeah, 8 times out of 10, people within the security space, they may kind of fringe and not be the word they're most accustomed with, but they will kind of get what you're getting to. The problem is for everyone else in the organization. Right? If you as a CISO, you are getting you're getting your head of incident response, your head of risk management, and they're all presenting their slides and they're talking about the same thing but calling it different, then you're going to be creating some disfluency on your speech, and that is going to make people focusing on what does he actually mean. Was that the same word that the other guy was using, as opposed to be focusing on the message that you want to get across. Okay, so by adopting, and this is available for free online, called the Bishop Fox Cybersecurity Style Guide, and has a few recommendations on words to avoid, words to use, the type of context to use each one. And I think this is really powerful on making sure that that you are using a similar type of message, particularly in written documents, when you write documentation, etc. So this was actually written to support security researchers on getting to use a similar type of thing, but I think it's tremendously helpful as well to be used in organizations to ensure that we're all talking the same thing. So not talking 0 days, talking previously undisclosed vulnerabilities, all those types of things, to make sure that we can get one word that people understand and that we standardize on using that word in everything we write. And then finally, using SABSA. So SABSA is an enterprise security framework that enables traceability of how you're doing your business attributes, and then how you end up at the security components that you choose. So it allows you to, it's a 36-cell based matrix that allows you to define security services, to define your whole governance, and encompasses everything you can think of from an enterprise security perspective, ensuring that you take care of not only the business aspects, but also the technical aspects of security. So the one thing why I particularly like SABSA is because of the attributes profiling, what I was referring to previously as the business attributes. So this is the list of 85 business attributes. So obviously we're not going to talk specifically about any of them, but the way SABSA consulting exercises usually start is by having some interviews with the senior people. Okay, and I'm just going to use one example. So if you're going to be talking with a CFO of your organization about security, I almost bet you that he's going to refer that one of the concerns he has about the security team is about hindering his ability to be quick to market, right? Because security teams are typically perceived as being impediments to business speed, right? So for instance, if that happens here in the business strategy side of things, you've got something called enabling time to market, right? So as a SABSA architect, what you do is you go have interviews with the different senior people in the organization, and I almost guarantee that 85 to 90% of their concerns, you're going to find one business attribute on this list that you can map it to. Right? Be it the marketing officer, being the CFO, the operations officer, whatever may be the case. And what that then enables you as an enterprise security architect is to actually create a traceability throughout your whole organization of how security is helping meet that objective. Okay, so So this is an example of how an architectural traceability using SAPSA typically looks like. So you start at the top with what are the organization goals, which can either be control or enablement objectives. And then what are the management goals that are that's supported. So for instance, being compliant means that it's going to be legal and governed. Okay, being competitive means that you're going to need to be enabling time to market. So the security goal is that you want to do things in an automated fashion, right? To enable that time to market, so not hindering the speed of the organization. And then you develop a number of security services that are supported by particular mechanisms that are delivered by particular security components. Right? And you do this type of traceability across everything that is there for you. Right? So it's obviously not a good idea to work off of the 85 business attributes. Typically, you decide between 5 and 7 or 8, and then you enable your traceability throughout your enterprise security architecture of how you're going to, again, this is about defining the strategy. How are you going to implement that strategy? Through a layer of services, mechanisms, and the components, so the actual technology that you'll be using to enable it. And this serves two purposes in organizations, because if you look at this from the top down, you get what is the completeness of your security architecture. So how complete it is in achieving the objectives that were set by the senior management team. So business driven and business led, right? And not just something that the CISO came up with based on the best practices or the Gartner quadrants, right? This is what the business driven and business led attributes. And on the other hand, from the bottom up, you get the justification. Right? The justification for all of the security components and the things that you'll be spending your budget on. Right? So this gives you a really good entry into establishing a strategy, because you get both. When you start enabling in having this traceability, you can then see exactly where you're spending your money and if you're spending it on the right things for your stakeholders. And sorry, from a doctrine perspective, so another 3 elements of doctrine that this enables is about thinking small, so knowing the actual details of how you're achieving your objectives, knowing your users, because you can only agree those high-level business attributes if you talk to the senior management team and understand what are their concerns. And this also allows you to focus on what their needs are, right? Because anything that you're probably, and I would say from experience, you're probably spending 30 or 40% of your budget on things that you probably couldn't trace back to a high-level objective from the board, right? Then that tells you that that's money that's probably better spent elsewhere, right? Or even if that's not the case, it allows you to have to understand that particular component is not currently traceable to a high-level objective, and then you know that your job next is to go convince why people should be worried about it, right? So it serves both purposes. It's not just you shouldn't be doing it. Is if you still think you should be doing it, then that gives you a good introduction to, okay, someone else is not seeing why we need to do this. So now it's my job to now go there and make sure that they understand why it is that we need to be doing it. And this is an example of how to put all of that on a map. So starting with the business attribute at the top, then some of the services, so using automated as an example, some of the services that you'd create in your security organization to do it, what would be the mechanisms to actually achieve those, to implement those services, and what is the actual tech that you'll be using in order to do that. And then this is something that should be evolving, right? The components you use now, you may need to use more in the future, you may need to use less. Yeah, it depends on where you are and what you want to focus on. And again, this is the reason why maps are powerful, is because you've got here on a page, on a screen, right? An image of the maturity of the components that you're using. So we're mainly using products in this space, some things that are more custom built because you're going to be having to build some manual compliance things, maybe because maybe what's out there doesn't completely fit your purposes. And you can see how advanced and and how stable your components would be. So another important aspect of doctrine is about removing duplication and bias. And this is where I think applying a SAPS approach also helps a lot with that, if you use it in a different way. So instead of focusing on the board's concerns and then mapping it down, right, if you do it the other way around, kind of stop what you're doing and go see across your security budget, across your IT budget, across your HR budget and your finance budget, right? Because typically you can find security controls in all of these areas, right? Security controls is not just what the security team does or audits, etc. There's a lot that can be leveraged, and that they typically, those other areas of the organization do that support the security objectives. Okay, so if you go do an exercise of understanding what are the security controls that those other areas in your own, through technology, through policies, through standards that you're currently doing, and kind of put it all on a page, experience tells me that you're going to be amazed at how much duplication you may have already. And that should tell you one of two things. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're doing something wrong, but it allows it to be challenged and allows you to think, okay, I've got 2 or 3 of these. Should I really have 2 or 3 of these? Should I not be thinking about consolidating some of those? Okay, and I have an example of what that could look like using malware protection as an example, for instance. So this is a fictitious scenario where, so we would have a Win7 estate. The size of the ball lets you know how big that estate is. So this organization, we can see that has more Win7 than Windows XP or Windows 10. Then we've got some Mac OSs as well. Then we've got 3 different AV products in use currently in the organization, right? Let's say. So Sophos for Windows XP. We're using Trend Micro just for Mac OS, and we now have most of our infrastructure already Win7 and Win10 in McAfee. And we've got the expertise. So how good are our teams, current teams? How comfortable are they managing that product, the operation of that product? So in this example, we would have, so Sophos, something that people haven't used in a long time. So, you know, it's not very well managed. Trend Micro, because the team had used it for a number of years and the team's been there for a long time. So, you know, that people know how to use it. They know the ropes quite well. But this new SaaS McAfee solution that you've applied, so stage 4, going back to what I mentioned previously, that you already have most of your OS estate in this new platform, but you know that the team is still coming to grips with how that works on making really good, effective use. So again, the only way I know of on a page portraying all of these ideas is using a map. And I think Wordly maps are really quite powerful in that regard, because in a page, you can put all of those assumptions on the table, have a discussion with your peers. So how big is the estate? Are we really better at managing Trend Micro than we are at McAfee? Why is that the case? Do people have a disagreement on why that is? Yep, and seeing what other AV products you potentially have out there that didn't even make it to the list, right? Maybe someone knows of something that is still in use on one of the warehouses that no one's been there in 20 years, right? So it's all those things that, again, going back to doctrine, allows you should be focusing on removing the duplication and bias. So that was it with regards to that problem. Then we have the engineering problem. So the problem here is that we're engineering for attributes that are really not as relevant as they used to be. So we're still, we haven't really co-evolved practices. And we're still getting to terms on what that means. So going back to the initial IT enterprise adoption cycle, so the IT enterprise already started adopting cloud, etc., and security as a whole still has a bit to catch up to that. And the problem with engineering is, I quite like the Dave Edwards Deming conversation, is that it's not necessary to change. Survival is not mandatory, right? And we will be talking specifically about the coevolution of components here and also the Red Queen effect, which are also two aspects of climate from worldly mapping. So the security standards turned into memes. So all those 200 security standards that exist out there, and people arguing mine is better than yours, blah, 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 that you see a lot of people in security fighting for. And on the other hand, the bolt-on security vendor-driven approach to security. So every time we want to do something securely, we go get a product to fix that problem for us. I quite like this current security analysis from the University of Virginia, from Professor Barry Horowitz, that he says, when you ask an engineer to make your boat go faster, you get the trade space, right? You can get a bigger engine, but give them some space in the bunk. You can change the hull shape, but affects your draw. You can give up some weight, but affect your stability, right? But when you go ask to an engineer to make a system more secure, they pull out a pad, they start making lists of bolt-on technology, and they're going to give you a price, right? And unfortunately, this is still a lot of how we approach security. So the Red Queen hypothesis. So this is something from nature, right? That is also applicable to IT systems and to everything generally. So for no evolutionary system, continuing development is needed just in order to maintain its fitness relative to the system it is co-evolving with. Right? So what that means in simpler terms is that the changes are happening within your organization, but those changes aren't there to get you competitive advantage. They are there to keep you in business, right? And that's a thing that sometimes people that don't really understand business, they think we're all doing all these things because we want to be number one. Indeed, it's good if there's a way to get a competitive advantage out of change, that's brilliant, right? But 8 times out of 10, you're just doing it to keep in business, right? You're doing it to keep your relative status to where you are in your industry. So the example here is about the use of CRM, right? So in the early 80s, that's when you start seeing a few organizations adopting CRM. In 2019, you need to have a CRM to even be in business, right? If you don't have a CRM system, you're not in business, right? So it came from something that was competitive advantage for the early adopters, that they started being more agile in how they manage their customer base, to being a cost of doing business in this day and age, right? So yeah, and that's what the Red Queen hypothesis talks about. Then the other important aspect from worldly mapping is the coevolution of practice. Okay, so this is the IT example that everyone can relate to. So we have here computing evolving as a whole, and then we got to a space where we had compute as products. And this is the age where everyone was building their own data centers. Then we moved on to co-location when people started getting concerned about price, etc. But the main thing here was that as we evolved into products, what happened is you started getting a practice of N+1 in terms of good architectural practice. So you knew that every time you needed to buy a new server, it took between 3 and 6 months for it to get on site, and if you to install and do all the business things you want to do with the server. So a few emerging engineering practices evolved that came to good and came to be perceived as the best way to engineer systems. But then compute also suffered a transformation. It went from being a product-based industry to a commodity space, i.e., cloud came along. And when cloud came along, what that meant was that we no longer needed to wait 3 to 6 months to get new hardware. We just had the hardware there that could be provisioned within 10 minutes. So that made two things. The first is waterfall project management is probably not the best thing to do anymore because you can iterate much faster, right? So you can be more agile in the way that that you are delivering things, because you don't have all that wait time to actually be in the position to start doing something. And also that also changed how we do architecture, how we engineer systems. At that point, you're adding more capacity. It's not buying more hardware, right? You can now think about having smaller pieces of code and having microservices, having a different way of how you approach software development, because you can now just scale out and do it on demand without having that hindrance of mean time to repair being so big. And this also applies to security. So when these things evolve, so the way we did security for systems 5 years ago is not the way we need to think about security and about security engineering, particularly going into this this day and age. So where does the security fit into all of this? So Sonil Yu, so in the RSA 2017 talk, he mentioned about how to map the NIST framework onto the past couple of decades. So security started being as an identified problem back in the 80s, where people, were just trying to understand where our systems are, where they, what they were, etc. So we're more focused on maybe a few vulnerability scanners, but that was about it. We just wanted to get systems in place. No one really thought much about security back then. Then the 90s came along. We started having the first few virus outbreaks, the first few firewalls. So because of those outbreaks, we started thinking about network segmentation. So we started getting some firewalls to protect our perimeters. And we started giving a step towards secure config. But there was still pretty much security was kind of managing vulnerabilities. Right? So a new vulnerability came along and we tried to deal with that. Then the 2000s came along. That's when you started thinking about SIEM, so correlating events, etc., and IDS, so intrusion detection systems. So at that point, that's when you started getting the boom on security operations centers, people talking about managing threats, etc. Then we have the 2010s, which are the respond era. So we're focusing more on incident response. It's now kind of a truism that everyone's compromised. So what we need to be really good at is to recover, to respond to those incidents and have processes in place to do that well. So risk management, we started being more mature in this space as well. And actually that's when, if you look down here, it's on the 2010s where you have a break from security, stop being a CIO concern and typically going under a different umbrella within the organization. So typically a CFO or its own umbrella somewhere else. So there was that break between the teams. But now we've got the 2020s coming, right? And what Sonil Yu is saying is that in the 2020s, this is all going to merge again, right? Because engineering practices are now focusing on resilience, and the big organizations like the Netflix, the Facebooks, etc., everyone's starting to understand that when you build for resilience, you get pretty secure systems. So what he's saying is that in terms of how we are now approaching security into the 2020s, that the security teams are going to have to focus on understanding how to make the IT secure, as opposed to choosing the right bolt-on to make IT secure, which is apparently where we're all going. I find interesting so from the World Health Organization, they usually say that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Right? But this is brilliant, and I'd like us to get to a place where this is how we think about healthy systems, because it's not, right? At this point in time, and for the past 25 years, what the security industry has been doing is taking care of the absence of disease or infirmity, right? We find a disease, we find an infirmity, and go there, do the security guacamole we've been doing for the past 25 years. And we're now into the 2020s. We're getting the opportunity to rethink it and hopefully start getting some more healthy IT. So this is another map that talks about things that are commodity bound. So typically the traditional SDLCs, the compliance, etc. Some of the growth, some of the practices that are growing. So continuous deployment, DevOps, and cloud adoption. And then the things that are emerging. So security as code, compliance as code. This was done by Matthew Burton Spall So he's an independent consultant working for the UK government. And I use this version of this map also later on. But basically, one of the things he mentions here is also about rugged software. So rugged software describes a software that has development organizations that have the ability to create available, survivable, defensible, secure, and resilient software. And that this is achieved through competition, cooperation, and experimentation. Right? So a great example of that is Netflix. They are kind of typically known for their chaos engineering practices, where they've got some software that breaks things on purpose in production so that they can learn straight away and make sure that their systems are resilient. So what I find brilliant about the Rug Manifesto, which I would suggest everyone read, is how it words it, right? Because so being rugged means that you constantly patch and refactor your software development organization to eliminate the organizational bugs, right? So it's not just about focusing on the developers. It's not focusing on the testers. It's also not focusing on the security people, right? It's focusing on the organization. Right? It's focusing on making sure that the software development organization is getting more mature, is getting more resilient. Right? And using words from Andrew Schaffer, if you think you're not a software organization in 2019, you're going to lose to someone who is, right? Because we're all in this business now, right? Even the ones that think they're not. So a way to start is thinking about some of the security anti-patterns. And the NCSC, UK government agency, talks about some of them. So just lifting and shifting your systems from on-prem to the cloud is not going to give you the resilience that you're going to need into the 2020s. So you need to think about what are these all of these anti-patterns that we did in the past, like back-to-back firewalls as well, and make sure that you're not just replicating those types of practices in your cloud systems, because that's not going to, referring back to the Red Queen, that's not going to keep you competitive, right? You need to do things differently if you're to stay in the market. I don't think that's enough, though, and there are a lot of things happening in merging the engineering practices from the safety world back into the security engineering as well. So Lefson has a lot of good information on that. But the main takeaway from the system, and this is something that still happens a lot, and a lot of security people kind of being less than nice to some of the users for clicking on phishing emails, that type of thing. So a system that fails on user error is a system that is in need of re-engineering, right? And that's been a big part of the problem, why there, as security engineers and even as IT engineering, we've been focusing too much on the tin, on what we do to make the tin work, and we're not really designing, understanding the screen out, right? So how our users, how our customers, how our business users, and how our privileged users are using the system, and what are the safety mechanisms that will allow us to have a secure system that will have warnings for when any of these operators do an action, and what that actually means to the safety of the system. And that's, I think, what the next level is going to look like into the 2020s. So it's about identifying the losses in safety and security constraints. So identifying the scenarios which are unacceptable, right? And then building your functional model around those constraints, okay? Considering not only the tin, but also how people will be using the tin. And that's kind of on the engineering problem side of things. Now we've got the management problem. So the RSA chief exec in 2017 as well, I really like this quote. There is too much spending on the wrong things. Security strategies have been driven and sold on fear and compliance issues, with spending on perceived rather than genuine threats. So I was referring to initially, so not just copying memes, but actually understanding your business and understanding where you need to invest. That's what's not happening at the moment, right? And so we also have that old IT phrase, no one ever got fired for choosing IBM. So I have my own security version of it, which is no one ever got fired for spending their budgets according to Gartner's Magic Quadrants. right? Which I also think is part of the problem. So in terms of doctrine, so the management problem, it's about doing better with less. It's about thinking fast, so fast, inexpensive, restrained, and elegant. It's also about managing the inertia, not only our own in how we manage our teams, but in adopting these new practices and having a bias towards the new. We need to start thinking about how we're going to be at the front of all of these new resilient way of doing things. And also having not much of a choice due to Red Queen, etc. So the security market is stratospheric. It's predicted to reach 120 billion. Yeah, in 2017, it was already worth more than 120 billion. So we know we're spending a lot of money. And what's interesting here is that all of this digital transformation move to the clouds. We're not they're being driven by the CEOs. I have the personal experience of having seen a new CEO coming in because the previous one wasn't doing the digital transformation fast enough. Right. So this is getting at the board level. This is getting people into jobs and out of jobs. Right. And what's interesting is that so John Chambers from Cisco, so that this isn't simply a matter of competitive advantage. It is existential. And 40% of today's businesses will fail in the next 10 years, and 70% will attempt to transform themselves digitally, but only 30% will succeed. Right? This is kind of quite scary stuff, but yeah, I do think it's probably right. So, but going back to the engineering problem, so if we agreed in the past when talking about the engineering that the security solution of the future is the IT solution being resilient and providing that security out of the box, then what does that mean to the CISO budget? Right. So what is the implication? Because at this point in time, we know that CISOs are getting budgets into the millions, but if in the next decade that is going to change, and we're going to need to be focusing on how to make IT secure, what is that going to mean to the CISO budget? And will the CISOs, most of the CISOs of today, be happy with that change? Right? Because again, that's something that is common in business. If you've got someone that's been doing this for 5 to 10 years, being a CISO for 5 and 10 years, telling them that in 5 years he's going to have less than a third of the budget he currently has, there's going to be inertia, right? Yeah, and I think this is we're going to see this a lot. I would be expecting to see some power plays and some FUD to be used back to the boards in order to protect something that may be perceived as being taken away, even though it's just a co-evolution of practice. Right? And I think that's a problem that I think I can foresee that is going to happen, and I'm interested in see how it plays out in the actual market. But the problem is there are so many vendors out there, and more keep happening due to the VC nature of security startups that we're seeing, that all of that money, will we keep justifying things we don't need? Will we still be thinking about this bolt-on security technology and actually making it worse for organizations to actually be secure and achieve those levels of resilience? Right? Because going down that route would be even worse than where we currently are, right? So I hope that we learn how to do things differently. So yeah, about this power play and supporting the continuous reduction. So how are we going to play that back in the market? And the interesting thing is why a CISO is getting fired. And I think this was a really interesting article that I got to see. So we can see people from a business side of things saying that mostly centered about an inability to address risk to a satisfactory state and in an economical manner, right? So I think I read into this is actually the opportunity going into the 2020s, because if you can now make resilient systems and actually request less budget and be more integrated with the developers and the operations teams, this is the opportunity, right? Poor reporting, exceeding budget, not following business strategies, or even spreading the FUD, right? Rather than delivering practical solutions to the problems. And the thing is, this will require not only complete understanding how to properly manage short and long-term projects, completing at scale and against budget, but also the technical knowledge and security understanding to ensure the right priorities are being addressed. Again, back to what is important to our stakeholders and not what we think the compliance thing is saying or what Gartner is saying we should be spending our money on. And I put it in red because this is where I disagree with the article, right? So it's suggesting that the CISO role is almost a unicorn, that you need to be technical but with people skills, executive level but with project management capabilities, and laser focused prioritization but with broad overview knowledge and understanding, right? So I don't disagree, all those things need to happen, right? What I'm going to use an analogy first, right? You don't expect CIOs to be masters of procurement, masters of development, masters of everything that is involved in an IT organization, right? What you do expect is him to surround himself with the people that complement those skills, right? And I can't see that this is any different, right? We all know that we all bring a certain set of skills to the table, and what I think CISOs and security teams need to understand is that we're all necessary, that we're all bringing different perspectives, and that as long as we're aligned on the same strategy and have coherent actions that we're all taking towards addressing the same problems, that we're going to be fine. Right? But expecting one person to be the sum of all virtues, that's not going to happen. So, and again, getting the doctrine right, focusing on user needs, removing that bias and duplication. So we've been through some of these before. So finally, we've got the skills and talent problem. So the adoption of automation for IT security functions is on the rise. We know that AI is going to play a big part of it. And we know we're starting to see security being adopted as code and compliance being adopted as code, right? I think this is a challenge, and we're going to talk about another concept from understanding climate in worldly mapping, which is creative destruction. I think, namely, the governance, risk, and compliance teams and consulting functions will be particularly will struggle particularly with some of these concepts, right? Because as we're moving to a more declarative world where everything is code, people that can't read code will be at a disadvantage. But if we don't find different ways of doing our jobs. And from a skills and talent, it's about making sure that we've got a systematic mechanism for learning, right? So going back to Andrew Schaffer, that has some great content on these type of issues as well. He mentions that if you're not building a learning organization, you're going to be losing to someone who is, right? And he has another interesting concept that he introduces, which is if there are organizations that are successful, they become graduate studies of the things that are important for the organization to succeed, right? So it's not just going out on the markets and hiring the right people, it's ensuring that you build the culture and the mechanisms and the knowledge internally, so that when someone comes in, you can provide that graduate studies to your new resources on how to be effective and how to be good at what they came in to do, right? And that's also going to be a big thing into the 2020s. So creative destruction, this is also something that applies everywhere. So the effect of continuous innovation is to devalue, if not destroy, past investments and labor skills, right? And what I find interesting is the way this is written is this is embedded within the circulation of capital itself, right? And this is another big concept in worldly mapping, that as soon as something evolves and reaches to a commodity, it gives rise to higher order systems. So you can now do bigger and better things because some components have commoditized. So some of the expert in manual labor that was required in stage 2 and 3 of doing something, they're no longer required when it reaches a stage 4, when it becomes a commodity or a utility. So if all you know how to do is that a manual labor of stage 2 and 3, you're going to struggle because as it ends, workers shift from one line of production to another, leaving whole sectors devastated, right? And this is something that is, again, this is, it's not horrible. This is how things work. This is just business as usual, right? This has been happening for a long time and will keep on happening. And with us insecurity, it's not going to be different. So first, some things that I don't agree with. I don't think there's a skill shortage, right? There mostly we have a poor understanding of what we need, and we don't understand the skills that need to be leveraged to do good security coming into the 2020s, right? And also, we don't have a talent shortage. We probably don't have a mission worth getting out of bed for, or a culture which is fostering people to actually be wanting to, right? Because I've worked in different kinds of organizations, and security is a hard job, right? And we end up, because 8 times out of 10, the business doesn't do what we want, we end up getting some, not thick skin, but we end up being a bit cynical about the progress, and even getting to conclusions of lack of diligence because they're not doing the things the way we would expect them to do, right? And that is something that when you've got an integrated organization where security is, again, you're building resilient systems, etc., and everyone's working towards a shared and common objective, you actually have a standing chance of security not being seen as those other guys, but being the people that help the organization become more resilient, right? And that's what we should be aiming for. So in terms of skills, it's about the ability of using your knowledge effectively and readily. In talent, it's about a special ability that allows someone to do something well, right? And so in terms of these things, and this is a more advanced worldly mapping concept, but the idea of pioneer settlers town planners. So we're not going to go through all of that. All I'm going to say about this slide is there are things that are typically more to the left, so more Genesis or custom built, you will typically be, and if that's where you are in terms of the security controls and the security things that you do, then you probably want to think of hiring people that can deal well with failure, that they're used to getting novel things and getting kind of pushed pillar to post every couple of days into new things. That's the type of profile that you want, right? Because if you put someone that is more a town planner, so someone that thinks more Six Sigma about process and managing process deviation, etc., in an environment where you're pushing them pillar to post every couple of days, it's not, they're not bad people, they're not bad professionals, they're just being used in a context that doesn't come naturally to them, and they're going to struggle. Right? So understanding that going into the 2020s, we also need to be thinking about both attitude and aptitude. So both of them before we make hiring decisions. This is hopefully to help security professionals just come up with a view on how to look at security. So here on the right, we've got the traditional things that are how we've been doing security for the past 20 years. In blue, we've got things that are being asked of that have high value on the market at the moment. So application security, DevOps, threat modeling, continuous integration, continuous deployment. Those are the things the market is requesting of us now, and cloud as well. And then we've got the things that, this is aligning the concepts from Michael Burton's Paul that I've showed you, the other map, and also Sonil Hughes from the RSA 2017 talk, and mapping back to it. It's about those concepts that are likely to be coming into the 2020s and become really important. So not the security bolt-on, how to use cloud native capabilities to build security into the things that we do. So thinking about the secure IT, thinking about security as code, compliance as code. So everything being declarative, and not only people being able to write what security looks like in the as code, but also read how secure things are by reading the code. And again, adopting some safety engineering, which I think is probably the one that is more to the left, that still has a lot of growth to do. So, and then obviously DevSecOps, etc. Particularly in terms of risk management, for instance, the typical qualitative approaches are probably reaching their end of line. More because now we have so much data that is generated by cloud, that is generated by the systems, by machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence. We were starting to get so much data that qualitative approaches to risk management are now becoming more feasible and more readily available. So people that are also in that governance, risk, and compliance type of space should also be thinking about how to evolve their risk management practice to qualitative approaches as well. And the idea here is not to make it daunting, but hopefully the way I built this diagram is to hopefully give you a glimpse of the skills. If you know you've got skills in particular areas, to think about the connections to other areas and how you can leverage what you already know in order to help you make the transition. Right? So hopefully to help you with a training plan. So things to learn up on approaching security, focusing on AppSec. So everything will be about the runtime, especially now with serverless coming along. So if you want to be in security, you need to understand application security. You should be thinking about how to threat model. So Adam Shostak's book is still authoritative in that statement. Brilliant book. I think everyone should read it. You should really understand what Agile and DevOps is. So not just what you're reading that people are going too fast and delivering things X amount of times a day. Actually understand how it developed, how it came to be, because it's going to give you some good insights into how you can make it secure. So the books, the Phoenix Project and DevOps Handbook by Jim Kim and others, I would definitely advise you to read them. So in terms of current industry needs, so understanding tools of the trade for DevOps, GitHub, GitLab, etc. You should be, even if you're not from a technical background, look, you've got Udemy courses for £10 that can get you started on some of these things. Just go and do a few, I would suggest. So understanding how security is implemented in CI/CD pipelines. So a lot of these things are open source. You can do tons of things with open source. So try and explore those. And also getting some formal training. So I particularly like Practical DevSecOps as providing training for all of these. And for future looking needs, so you need to learn how to code, or at the very least learn to read code, right? At least understand some languages and look at a piece of code that is relevant to security, understand what that actually means. Getting familiar using Git, so version control systems, learning how to make the most of cloud native. Don't think security as a bolt-on. And AI and machine learning will be key. So you should probably spend some time learning some data science, etc. Obviously, I'm not suggesting you do all of the above, start with all of them tomorrow, right? Those are things that are going to be needed in the future, and hopefully to allow you to think what part you want to play, what areas you wish to focus on. Though I do think that knowing the first 20% of any security discipline is always a good idea. Even if it is a £10 Udemy course or something like that, just to spend 9 or 20 hours over the next 6 months learning the basics of some of these things will put you miles ahead of mostly everyone else. So again, be a champion of tools enabling business speed, so resilience, data science, machine learning, automated threat modeling, and understanding how privacy will play a role in those, learning about engineering, safety engineering, and the observability and how you can get security value from all of that. So just going through very quickly on slides what we've been through. We started like this, the current security industry. I think if we solve some of our communication problems, we'll be evolving some of our practices. If we address some of our engineering problems, we're going to be co-evolution of some practices, so we're going to start from scratch. But hopefully we can then start giving them the steps forward to make those more mature very quickly. So the management problem, so about inertia, the budget erosion, applying some doctrine, you can make, again, a few other benefits. And then if you solve the skills and get your security teams to be very good at dealing with a new way of doing things, you also will get there, right? And hopefully things will be good and they'll be much sunnier. We'll have much more evolved than what we are right now, right? So just some final thoughts. This went for way longer than I originally expected. So Sonil Yu, he mentioned about his talk was that we could solve cybersecurity in 5 years. So now, after doing all of the research for this talk, I think he's right. So we're not going to solve data breaches will keep on happening, and not all of the organizations on the planet are going to solve their cybersecurity problems, right? But your organization's cybersecurity problem, right? 5 years is really it's a good time frame, right? So I really like so one of the masters that I follow in jiu-jitsu, so John Danaher, he has a a brilliant quote that he usually teaches his students, which is people tend to overestimate how much they can achieve in 6 months and grossly underestimate how much you can achieve in 5 years. Okay, and I think a lot of the way we approach security also comes with that kind of problem. If we're only thinking about short-term cycles of 6 months to a year, yes, it's going to be daunting, and you're probably going to be overshooting, probably over-promising and under-delivering, right? Because things take time. There's a lot that needs to co-evolve with the things that we also need to change. But if you start thinking in wider time spans of up to 5 years, and if you are consistent and targeted and coherent on the actions you're taking to address your cybersecurity concerns, I cannot see how on an horizon of 5 years, how any organization, almost whatever the size, can't address at least 90% of their security problems. Right? And hopefully that's where we're all going to be. So these were the 5 things that we covered. So the communications problem, threat taxonomy, style guides, and SABSAN. The engineering problem, so focusing more on cloud or IT native security, root software, safety engineering, and anti-patterns. So avoiding the mistakes we've done in the past, or not the mistakes, avoiding the practices that are no longer relevant to the environments as they're now built, right? The management problem, so understanding how we're going to do smart spend and reduce the number of suppliers that we have, applying doctrine, and also establish learning. So in learning, it's not learning is not education, learning is not college degrees, learning is learning, right? Is having skills that can actually allow you to do a job. So it needs to be technical, project management, quantitative risk analysis, and on prioritization and focus. So not the 614 things, focusing on the thing, on objectives that we can have as coherent objectives across different teams. So we actually have a standing chance. And finally, the skills and talent problem. So hiring for aptitude, attitude, understanding what's needed, focus not only on the current needs of the market, but what of the future needs, because you don't want creative destruction to be affecting you, right? You still want to be here and have a job tomorrow and have skills that are relevant for the jobs, and helping the teams handle that change and deal with that change, which isn't always easy. So change is not necessary for survival, but we want to be here. And each of us, we can either keep on hanging on to our old ways of doing things, or we can understand that it's not that our knowledge is inadequate, it's that the components have evolved, practices have evolved, and our security practice needs to co-evolve with it. So more than that, we know none of us want to allow ourselves to become Mr. Irrelevant, right? So, and it's by understanding what the market is currently needs from us and what are the future needs that are about to become on the market, that we can be sure that we develop the plans not to become irrelevant. And that's me. We're now 48. That was a long time. So hopefully you've enjoyed the content. There's a lot to go on here. Yeah, but these are some thoughts on how I think we can adopt. We can understand evolution. We can understand doctrine in climate. So these things that are happening, independent of what security or even business people think about it. Right? This is just the nature of how things are evolving and how we can apply some of those concepts to evolve our security along with it.
Mario, that was absolutely amazing. You just gave us a masterclass on the immediate future and of security. And I really am thinking now this question of can all this be solved in 5 years? And it's like the old quote, right? The security future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And
yep.
There's so much to take away from this. I personally have found myself challenged hearing what you offered. I'm reframing my thinking from security as a constraint to security as an enabler. And you demonstrated exactly what that would look like. And it's just amazing. How much work went into putting all this together? I imagine you've spent quite a bit of time researching and exploring all these questions.
So, kind of. So I spent. So some of the things from a security point of view. So I've always been I've always worried about keeping relevant, right? So there wasn't, I didn't have much catching up to do, right? So the work I did was mostly on making sure that I had credible references and things that I was referring to, and also making sure that I was framing them from within the context of the problems. Right?
So you've been working on this presentation for 23 years, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It was a lot of that, but in terms of putting the content together, I probably spent the last 2 months working on and off on it. But these were all kind of a combination of personal rants with things that I'm seeing on the market evolving, and even lessons that are hard lessons that I had to teach myself. Right. So, for instance, the thing about learning how to code. Right? So about a year-ish ago, I kind of I not kind of woke up one day and thought, look, I'm completely unprepared to what's coming ahead. But I can see these DevOps and DevSecOps and all of these things coming along. People that I'm seeing a lot of people that are now there weren't even security professionals 2 or 3 years ago, but they're now the security guys because they were the good DevOps engineers who understood a bit about security, right? So I started thinking, I need to keep up, right? I need to find a way to still be relevant in 5 years, and not only that, but it's again because I'm probably privileged in terms of having done all of those things that I shown on the map with a hands-on perspective, right? So I've been at this for a number of years. I always like to think about what it is that I can leverage, right? So now that I can do this, what else can I do with it, right? So focusing not so much on the inadequacies, but more on what are the skills that I can leverage so that I can hopefully now learn these things and make sure that I understand how to approach them. And obviously, having my own business in being a consultant, uh, I wanted to make sure um, that I have a coherent speech as well, right? Because hopefully, moving forward, whenever I find myself with a new customer, I can say, "Yeah, I call that the engineering problem." Right? Or I call that the skills and talent problem, and then I can just hopefully not spend 2 hours talking about it, but just explain in a couple of words, going back to some concepts on worldly mapping. And I also have an almost completed business degree as well. So because I started working in security quite young, I never took an IT degree. So again, it was thinking about the things that I didn't know then wanted to do. So a business degree would complement my skills more than just going to do an IT degree when I was already working for 12 years in the industry. So yeah, all of that thinking kind of coming together.
Yeah, yeah. The whole systems point is, I think, really interesting, and from the two facets that you explored, like the one side of it, which is the traditional barrier between the user frame and the engineering frame, in a sense. Like I like that you pointed out that user error is in fact an indicator that a system needs to be re-engineered, and then so there's that, and then you point at this other question about organizational refactoring and
Yep.
how the organization as a whole, as a system, I mean, it's the same problem all over again, right? You have business needs, business users, and if they're not seeing the value of security as an enabler, then there's something there that needs to be refactored and rethought. That's that's really interesting to me, and I think it points at some problems that we're not having the chance to talk about as much
Yep.
in sort of modern industry. And just to sort of like wrap that up, I'm thinking about I guess this has become kind of a slogan for you and for Privacy Beacon is, this idea of reasonable assurance against predictable threats.
Yep.
Yeah. So, like, tell me a little bit more about what's behind that slogan, because I know you and I are both reading The Fifth Domain right now.
Yep.
We're thinking a lot about just what does it mean to pursue security in the modern age? Could you tell me a little bit more about that slogan and
Yep.
what brought you to it?
So the main thing that was inspired by so the Abraham Lincoln's speech when he became president. So he told a tale of a Persian story, if I recall, in that he wanted to that a king wanted to come up with the statement that would be applicable in all types of scenarios. Okay, and what they came up with was these two shall pass away, right? And these two shall pass away was a way that look, if you're in a bad space, you can be rest assured that that too will pass away. If you're in a very good space, you also want to be reminded that these two shall pass away, because you want to make sure that you build in the mechanisms or the practices to ensure that when it does change, that you're still going to be okay, right? So there was kind of the initial inspiration. I wanted to get a sentence that could be used independent of context. Okay. The other side of that is also my experience as well, working in different security teams and doing different security things. Because on one hand, I've had the difficult situation of trying to speak with someone senior, and them not even being in the not even wanting to hear about that we've got massive access control problems that really do need some attention, and I need a resource from his team for a couple of days to go sort that out, right? And not getting a couple of days. So in my head, they're not really, they are the accountable parties, because security were a support function, right? I'm there to say what the problems are and try to help to get to a good state, but the owners of the systems, and it's IT, right, or someone else, not me, and being in the position where I thought, look, not saying it like that, but you're not really being diligent, right? You should be getting the reasonable assurance part of it right, right? And you're not providing the resources so we can provide any level of reasonable assurance that we've got something that is operationally fit. Okay. So there was, on one hand, what I sometimes saw, that security not even being on the table, right, and not being given the opportunity. So that reasonable assurance part of it. On the other hand, I also have a lot of experience, especially with security people that come from a more technical background, which ends up being on the other side of the spectrum. They want all the shiny security toys. They want all the latest technology. The budget needs to be, yeah, millions and millions, because there's all these things that all these toys we'd like to have, it don't, blah blah, right? And I also wanted to have something that I could say to them, right? Look, it's not about having the best technology on the market, the most expensive, the Gartner quadrant, right? Another thing that not many, but some people say in security is right people, right process, any reasonable technology, right? Look, the technology is the least of it. As long as it's a reasonable one, can get the job done, that's typically the least of the problems. Obviously, it needs to fix the problem it was meant to fix. But also, because of that experience of people always saying, oh, we wanted to do 5 different major IT platforms, we only got money for 2 or 3. Right? And also having a way to say them, look, it's on one side the reasonable assurance, right? So it's not overspending on tech because there's other things that you need to take care of. The business needs to actually make a profit. Yeah, all these business constraints that sometimes people that are more narrow focus on security for security tend to oversee what is the business context in which security is operating. And on the other hand, in that experience also with different both risk teams and design teams, which is sometimes you go talk to a stakeholder and that ends up affecting our credibility. So when I managed teams in the past, twice after a meeting kind of got someone from my team aside saying, look, there wasn't really a predictable threat, right? What you exposed on the situation was, if that happens, then the blue moon, and then on the third wave that comes, then we're going to have a data breach. But that's also not the way to go, right? We need to get the reasonable assurance against the threats that you can predict against them. So again, understanding the climate and the landscape, right? Understanding how our users, how attackers may interact with our assets, understanding the controls that we have in place across people, process, and technology, understanding what are the threats that may materialize on them. And yep, so basically trying to come up with something that I could use independent of context, right? A doctrine of some kind.
I think you've really succeeded. And think you recommended the Phoenix Project as one of the books to read about DevOps and related concepts. And I've had the privilege of working with one of the co-authors, Kevin Baer,
right.
and like everything that we're learning in these spaces, like it all connects. And your phrase, like "this too shall pass away," it's funny because Kevin co-founded along with Jay Bloom an enterprise consultancy called Praxis Flow, and one of the slogans for the time was "Memento Mori," so remember that you will die. It's like I just love how interconnected all this is. And to your last point, like this gets into the question of transformation, and I know you quoted Andrew Clay Schaefer a couple times, but one of his most recent talks at DevOps Enterprise Summit talked about how really when we're thinking about what reasonable means, right? It's not that we need to wake up tomorrow and suddenly be the most fit athlete. Right? Like this is like couch to 5K, right? I think was the reference that he made there. Like, tomorrow we need to make just a few better decisions than we did yesterday. So there's a question from the chat. I think this segues nicely into Adam asks, given that we've talked about communications, engineering, management, and skills and talent, what are the one or two security related concepts or thought processes that you think are undervalued most?
I think security concepts. Yeah, was that the question? Security concepts.
Yeah, security concepts or thought processes.
Okay.
Given this backdrop of transformation, everybody's thinking where to start. Like, what's the most undervalued thing that we in the community are missing?
So I think it's the resilience aspect of it, if I would name one, because if you come from a traditional background where you've had long long delivery cycles where people go away, review documents for 2 weeks before decisions are made, before budgets are set, etc., then you are in what you know how to do. The way success breeds inertia in that sense is that once they take that away from you and you have stories and sprints happening every 2 weeks, etc., it just goes too fast, right? And because you haven't necessarily gotten a way of understanding how the new world works and how much better off, even if you said nothing, right? Your security organization would be better if you just let them do what they're doing, right? And that's the thing that Sonil Yu also mentions on the talk, that most organizations are finding that they are becoming more secure, but they just wanted to be resilient. The secure aspect of it is coming with the resilience, right? It's not that look, the technologies that are supporting all of this, so like the Docker and the Kubernetes and all of those, they can be configured insecurely, right? But the landscape that you need to cover is now less, right? So you're no longer concerned that you're going to have a server that is owned as so we know, for instance, that some of the hacks, the ones that have been on the news lately, the attackers have been in the organizations 2, 3, 4 years, right? They're only being found after having a footprint on their networks for that amount of time. A company that is building resilient systems, it's not going to have that problem. You've got or at least not to the same extent, right? Because you've got organizations like Netflix, where some servers are up for 10 minutes. If something was to get compromised on that server, after 10 minutes, it's going to be killed. A new one will be coming up, and whatever wasn't persisted in that session is gone, right? I would say that I'm not understanding how resilience is making things so much better for us, or put in a different way, how we can add value in a resilience, how we as security professionals can add value in a resilience-focused world is probably the biggest impediment right now.
That requires a shift in mindset that it's going to take some time for us to really understand how to guide people towards this new future state.
And it's not just the mindset, right? It's also relates to the skills and talent problem, right? Because the people that are having an aversion, typically having an aversion to these new techniques, are the people that don't have the ability to go to the Git repo and read how secure the config is, right? Because if they had that ability, they would at least know, look, I've got a way into understanding the problem. I've got a way into making, so all of these security concepts that haven't changed, right? And that is another thing, that there isn't much new in security for the past 25 years, right? I started doing security engineering work back in 2003, right? At the time, I managed Linux servers, so the security people managed their own servers. We didn't have the people doing stuff, so I managed my security kit, and I managed all of the operating systems, so Linux, typically everything based. And even then, so we already used changeroot, which is kind of what made way into containers. So it's nothing new. We already used that back in 2002, 2003, right? The security laws of gravity haven't changed. There's just evolved ways of dealing with that change in ways that are much easier for everyone. But you still, in the early 2000s, you need to, you needed to have a way to authenticate people on systems. That's still a concern. You knew you need to have auditable systems. That's still a concern, right? And that's the good thing about SABSA, right? That I was talking, the enterprise security framework, and having that traceability, because what it also allows you is that the what you're aiming for at the top, so the auditable, the automated, all of those things, they're not going to change, right? Those are the things that are important to the organization. What does change is the composition of the services supporting it. It's the mechanisms and it's the components. Right? So if you, and that's actually an interesting, because SABSA didn't fundamentally change, then SABSA was written first in 2005. It survived the change of practices onto DevOps exactly because it's traceable. So the things at the top are still the same. You just change the mechanisms and the components that are required to support it. Right? And if people that understand SABSA have probably a better time in dealing with these changes, right? Because they've got this structure of the traceability. They can say, okay, so now we're doing things differently. Tell me what are the mechanisms that we can now use for the same thing, right? But SABSA is also not a very widely adopted standard. So some very big organizations do, but it's my opinion, that is still much of a management consultant driven type of activity. So there's still not much commoditization, let's say, into its adoption.
Awesome. Thank you, Mario. That is really thought-provoking. I'm definitely viewing the world of security in a very different way now, thanks to you. And thanks for stopping by. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.